a pavilion in the moss garden in Kyoto. See that beautiful moss, which people come out and manicure, pick every day. And you see, I mean, look at how they handle drain pipes, down pipes, water. Okay, just take bamboo and they do that with it. I asked him to pose outside of this thing because he's really picked up the Shokan Pavilion with the Tokonoma room with a round hole on it. That's his favorite motif. And so I said, you do that kind of thing. And he was saying, who, me? That's his answer, you know, that's why he gestures like that. And then I also asked him to pose by this, which he did with great embarrassment, I think, because of his interest, well, his interest in learning from the West and accepting anything. He says, you know, we accept everything. You know, Buddhists can accept all religions. Everybody can be a Buddha. You can be a Buddha. Tree can be a Buddha. Foot can be a Buddha. All is Buddha. And Jesus Christ was a Buddha, you see. And he looked at me and then he said, but not in your religion. You know, Buddha wasn't Jesus Christ, was he? He sort of laughed at me. So, you know, he's very aware of this philosophy of acceptance. And so that when you look at his schemes, for instance, his famous Helix City of 1960, which is this crazy biological analogy of metabolism, you know, designing double helixes. I'm not sure if the double helix was known then, I suppose it was. On DNA models, maybe, I don't know. And, well, on every 10th floor there would be a traffic intersection. This idea goes, I think, and his idea for mass production units, which are removable, recyclable, and rebuildable, goes right back to this temple construction of the Shinto emperor cult. They rebuild, you know, as I mentioned, yeah, so they rebuild that all the time. So he sees a direct affinity between metabolism and Shintoism. Here's an example of antagonistic coexistence. His drive-in Adakyu restaurant, which is a gigantic white space frame here, which holds a plug-in capsule in brown, which is the major restaurant, and then a beer, what he calls the beer garden on top, under this red tent. So he uses a bit of, you know, he's not afraid to use a bit of Fry Otto or whomever above a bit of Peter Cook and a bit of, well, whomever, Bucky or Friedman. And then do it with extra panache. I mean, this is the kind of roadside architecture which really attracts you in to eat. This is, I think, the equivalent, the Japanese equivalent of the hot dog stand in the shape of a hot dog. When we talked about this at length, he said, well, you know, we talk about brackets, Japanese brackets, and their love of under every eave of every temple is a kind of an explosion. He said the joint, this is a joint, this is an eating joint, right? So the joint swallows the building, and the building swallows the joint. And this is the joint, that's the dead center of the building. You can say, well, that's just a verbal pun. But in a sense, you know, I think it works as a traditional piece of roadside advertising. Now, it's what he calls antagonistic coexistence because it's a very harmonious, almost kitsch space here in, you know, shiny wood. She's in that, and very nice, pleasant. But then, instead of making it completely harmonious, he challenges it and puts something that's alien, which is this joint, right in the center, which he frames in glass, you see, like an icon. He says it's the balance between harmony and disharmony, which I'm always trying to achieve. So he'll often leave buildings half finished or half designed. Well, that's just to make the parallel with a very old, in fact, it's the oldest wooden building in Japan, I think. It's 8th century actual timber. It's the Horyuji Temple gate in Nara. And it shows, I mean, extraordinary thing, it shows the Japanese are picking up Doric columns which actually taper and have entasis, all right, even in classical Doric proportions. And then combining it with, of course, their kind of, Chinese, even painted red, Chinese bracket construction. They haven't really worked it out here. I mean, you can see it's a very early example where these, in later examples, the brackets go out to more and more brackets, and they wouldn't tolerate that kind of ham-fisted junction. Anyway, so that with that kind of design talent and interest in joints, it's then not surprising that Kurokawa would do that. The building which made him perhaps most famous is this Capsule building, the Nakagen Capsule building of 1972, constructed in the Ginza district of downtown Tokyo, the restaurant district. He designed a series of plug-on boxes here, cantilevered from two concrete cores. The boxes were constructed out of traditional container corporation design as steel containers, and they were shipped or driven from Osaka and lifted up by jacks that were cantilevered off here, lifted up into place, so that 140 different units were built. These units were projected mostly for bachelors and for traveling businessmen. But in fact, they've been used in different ways. And they were all sold immediately. It proved highly successful as a form of living. One of the reasons is that the Japanese travel so much that companies started buying them and say, instead of sending you to the hotel to live, they just send you to their company Capsule. And there you would stay for the weekend or for the 3 or 4 days you conducted business in Tokyo. A third of them are used as extension to the homes, and it's this kind of thing which Kurokawa sees as the importance of capsule architecture. He has a whole philosophy of the capsule. In fact, he has so many philosophies, Kurokawa, that when you talk to him, he has to have a Kurokawa concept committee, which goes around clearing up his concepts and seeing if his buildings are working according to them. The Kurokawa Concept Committee, which is made up of 8 members of his firm, goes around and rechecks the buildings every year and sees if they're working correctly or sees how they're failing, even adding things as they go along. So you see, I mean, it's not quite user participation, but at least there's a kind of feedback which is, as far as I know, is uncommon in the West. I don't know of many architects who have yearly checkups to see if their buildings are working. You know, and he replaces parts of the building if they're not working. In a way, though, that's traditionally Japanese, and the Japanese have always, you know, the whole question of honor and paternalism is very strong there, so that once you're hired in Kurokawa's firm, for instance, you're there for life, and if you're sick, or if you have a bad patch, or if you have an outbreak of anger, or you make a mistake, cause a building to fall down, you aren't fired. See, you're stuck with, and you're supported. Kurokawa will support you. So it has a very curious relationship of people to their institutions and to their businesses, which is completely unknown. It's said by West, I mean, typical Marxist view of this is that, you know, this is just bloody feudalism. Feudal paternalism, you know. Kurokawa happens to be the baron, and all his little serfs he's responsible for, just like a 14th century militarist. But, you know, that's so, it's a typical Western oversimplification, because it isn't feudalism. And the attitudes are so different that, you know, the reciprocity of attitudes is amazing. The way he, or a typical Japanese businessman, will feel a reciprocal responsibility with people who work with him. It's a very difficult issue. I mean, one could go on about it. Anyway, here the interior of these capsules is this kind of strange rotating window with built-in bed and all sorts of exotic equipment, which is in the James Bond tradition. You know, all the things that a bachelor would want to have at the press of a button, like calculating machines and computers and, you know, 24-track stereo and everything. But in fact, it's odd. Everything is in one cubicle except a place to cook. And I asked Kurokawa, he said, "Oh well, you can go out for a meal. There's too many restaurants right now." But it's silly, you know, to have everything and not be able to even just boil some coffee. Well, just before that building, the Takayama Pavilion was, I think, in a sense, along with the drive-in building, the first examples of what really metabolism would look like when fully metabolic. The Takayama Pavilion, constructed out of these tubes, 12 steel tubes bent to a common radius here with these kind of flange endings, looking like snorkels or some kind of octopus, which can be clipped onto and built in, extended out. So the whole building was erected in a week, or even maybe less than a week, on the site, and these steel capsules plugged into it, and the wiring, snaking out through the system. So a very clear example of what metabolism would look like, an extendable building which could grow and change, which was highly dissectable at the joints, in which was always complete, because it wasn't a classical aesthetic. It was that antagonistic coexistence. It was an uncompleted aesthetic. There you see the parts being lowered into place, and it was unerected in probably less than a week. So beautiful. It's the idyllic hills. I suppose it's the Palm Springs, if that is the place in America. Where is the idyllic? I don't know. The desert. For Japanese, always want to escape here, and he's built these same plug-in capsules, which he just ordered 4 more from that apartment for himself, and left them steel, and stuck them onto this concrete core, and then did the interior. There's the hole. He did the interior in many different styles, one of which was a completely traditional Japanese tea ceremony room. So you find this extraordinary juxtaposition of, on the inside of one of these capsules, a tea ceremony room from the 16th century in a perfect style, 4.5 tatami. Well, Karasawa caught on, and all around Tokyo, Japan, this is in Nagoya, they sprung up these little capsule hotels or capsule buildings. Unfortunately, people found them very unlikable as housing, and unfortunate for Karasawa, that is, and his reputation started to sink very quickly. He became, after Tange, the major architect, and now he's definitely going down, particularly in other architects hate him. You can imagine the jealousy he inspires. He's the most sincerely hated of the architects, among the architects. Anyway, he did this recently completed building, the Big Box, which has a rotating facade. It's a gigantic sports center. It's like a fun palace of Cedric Price, and 9 floors of funny things happening, and I mean funny. I mean, it really is amusing and amazing. Obviously, track on the inside, shooting, duck shooting, and other entertainment. There's for instance, on the top is a free record center, which has free pop concerts and all sorts of recording equipment so that you can try out new situations. And it has an anechoic chamber. It has record players on the wall that are vertical, so that you can get a minimum storage units. When Karasawa talks about it, and all of his buildings, one of his favorite concepts is this concept of Engawa Space. That's in-between space. And he tries to talk his clients into providing the semi-public space, which is not completely private, not completely public, which is a shelter to the outside, to people when it's raining, or it's an intermediate space. It's an in-between space. In fact, he got the concept partly from the in-between space of Van Eyck. But he more directly got it from the traditional work at Katsura. This is the Shokan Pavilion, one of the tea pavilions. And Shokan means joke. So it's, in a way, it's a joke pavilion, although a very, very serious joke for the Japanese, with, again, the holes. It sits out here. The eaves cantilever out over the outside area, which have these rocks representing some kind of mountains in a sea of sand here. And then it has this extraordinary wooden balcony area, which is neither inside nor outside, which is neither natural nor man-made. I mean, it's both. As you walk on it, it squeaks, of course, and gives out sounds, and it's a very anthropomorphic thing. But of course, it's made out of wood, which expresses its woodiness. I mean, the grain of it. Then you go into this area, which is again a kind of Engawa space. It's kind of, it frames these posts, for instance, frame the lake, which is over here, or some more trees. So Kurokawa then is again, when he seems to be mimicking the West, when he seems to be providing, and he's done this in several other buildings, the kind of space which the Ford Foundation building in New York gives, that is a gigantic interior-exterior space. He seems to be mocking the West. He's actually doing something that's very Japanese all along. This is the big box from the side with plug-in bathrooms and stairs, and on the inside, the Engawa space has 4 different ethnic restaurants and this plastic tree which grows up through 3 flights. Kurokawa not at all above being vulgar. I mean, one of his very nice qualities is his detailing this ersatz wrought iron work, and actually enjoying that. Very good restaurants they are. One Japanese, one Italian. Just under that is the Italian, French, and Spanish. And then on the 7th and 8th floor, you can play golf into the hills of Karasawa, which is an ersatz landscape, photo-montaged, very realistically. You can hit away here. They play golf on the tops of all their buildings in Japan. Or you can shoot laser gun shooting. You can kill some ducks, also in the Karasawa hills on the next floor. So you can see, the notion of artificiality and reality is really pushed way beyond notions here, even in Los Angeles, maybe, I don't know. Maybe, does this go on in Los Angeles? You have laser gun duck shooting? Well. Leaving Kurokawa and looking at a strand which mimics him and is close to him is the buildings by Watanabe, a different Watanabe from the one I mentioned at the outset. This one is a very sensitive designer who liked building wood, and then all of a sudden got completely, his mind was blown by the craze of archigram and the future. So he designed these sky houses in 1970 in an archigram image, or in a Kurokawa image. That is as high gloss silver, this is a silver building, high gloss silver steel color, but in fact these are just, and they look like buses stacked, look like airstreams stacked. So it looks like plug-in city, but in fact it's made out of traditional concrete in situ poured members with well, very traditional plans in a sense. They're just staggered plans. So he's been called by Michael Ross and others, he's been called the leader of the techno-aesthetic. It's an aesthetic rather than a fact of plug-in technology. You can see the roof is this kind of, actually there goes a wall, so it was in fact, in a certain sense, plug-in. The roofscape is a real ship fantasy and a Hans Hollein fantasy. Here is the kind of tanker plowing through the seas of the water. Well, Watanabe's father was a marine engineer, and he always expressed a desire to end up designing ships. So you can see that he's done it. Here's Sky Building number 5. And here's the typical reaction. It's a building. This curious-looking apartment house in Tokyo has naturally excited many pros and cons. Some have compared it to a torpedoed ship in World War II. Others to an upside-down rooster. Anyway, who cares as long as the elevator works? It's actually been compared to a lot of other things, like drag stripping with these exhaust stacks, But if a city can do this, and I suppose this is a very Los Angeles thing, if a city can have modern architects doing drag strips and upside-down roosters and torpedo chips, as a matter of course, then you've got an explosion of signification. I mean, you do have the empire of signs. You've got a situation where it looks like anything goes. Here's, for instance, the building produced by the SOM of Japan. It's the Nikken Seki office, which produced this building. It's called the All Japan Working Youths Hall. It's for a kind of, I suppose, trade union or something, or collective of some kind. And they produced what looks like a gigantic computer printout or IBM machine here. About to pull out a paper, right, out of the entrance here. In this very stark, extraordinary triangular shape. It's in the shape of a launching pad from this side. So if your SOM is producing this sort of thing, you can see how anomalous the situation there is there. You walk in the building, it has this very nice translucent skylight over it. Very nice space. They really can handle interior space, these designers. You go to the 14th floor and you find on one floor, in a very clean, well-lighted space, 10 different marriages going on in completely traditional clothes. And you can't, I mean, there's nothing remotely like it in the West. You can't imagine this kind of thing going on in the Union Carbide building in New York. Or, you know, if it were the West, their clothes, even if they were traditional, they wouldn't have gotten it right. Whereas this, you know, the women at least are in 6 layers or 12 layers of kimono, and their obi is right, and their sash is right. So they can be completely traditional and completely modern and not see any anomaly. So you get something like this happening, as a matter of course. These are the love hotels in Japan. There are 25,000 love hotels, and they're caused really by the fact that, you know, there isn't private, there aren't enough private rooms in the family home, so that the only place for love is in one of these. You have to drive out and stop in one. Here's the Hotel Meguro Emperor, which has 17 different rooms. It's the answer, I suppose, to the Madonna Inn. And in a way, I think it's better. The 17 rooms are all different, as the Madonna Inn's 120 are. It has here, the woman who built the building has imported real armor from Spain and mixed it with phony things. They all have these sunken bathtubs with lotuses and floating things. Well, to come down then to the architects they think are the most interesting, there's one, Arata Isozaki, who's recently finished this building, the Gunma Museum, north of Tokyo. It is a very nice essay in Super Studio style. In fact, what I should have said about Super Studio, I didn't show any of Super Studio buildings, but Super Studio said, or Natalini said, when every now and then I get a photograph from Japan of one of my completed buildings, and it's built much better than I could have ever done here in Italy, you see. So these things are being built. Super Studio is being built. And Isozaki is obviously doing more than just Super Studio. He's doing very many things in this building, but he's completely and utterly aware of the whole modern movement. So the buildings he produces are very complex games of mixing languages of different other architects. He's doing, you know, the silver architecture here, the Watanabe thing, in high gloss, the techno aesthetic. It's a museum, and he's doing the Peter Eisenman deep structure surface structure here. Here's the deep structure series of cubical spaces, which are all in the right angle except for this important one, which deflects off here, which holds the most important collection. He's taking this grid system and this deep structure and playing it at very many different scales. You see the grid picked up at that scale. You see it picked up a very tiny scale. And as you walk around, the whole thing becomes a fantastic sequence of spatial, of grids in space. You enter through this long bridge into, I suppose it's a triple height space with a building within it. It's a restaurant within triple height. And this bridge, spine, unifying the means of circulation. Then you come into the main display area here where most of the recent exhibitions are placed. To one side, you see the major long-term exhibition space, and you see how, for instance, Isozaki has used the non-joint joint of the rationalist. He's completely mastered that. That kind of just no moldings. A joint is simply the smash together of two parts, and it's quite staggering. Here are his ever-present signature of schnorkels and extract units, his homage to archigram. Some more up here. And then in one part of the building, a traditional tea ceremony room with, here you see a traditional tea ceremony occurring. So he'll do that too. Again, without any sense of anomaly. Well, he's quite consciously being anomalous when he produces this exploded space at the end, which fans out against perspective. So it's a space which climbs up in 3 dimensions away from you. It's like an Escher drawing. You know, it's an impossible space, which really just completely boggles your mind. You look down here and it gets closer to you as it goes away. Okay? I don't have any other buildings to show you of his, but here's a building, for instance, designed in the Stirling and archigram model. It was one of the first pop buildings in 1967. Now, the last group of designers I'll end with is a group called Architects. And Architects is a group of designers about the age of 40 who are, in a way, a commentary on other architectural movements. There was Archigram, then there was Archizoom, then there was a thing called Archibrain, believe it or not, and now Architects. Architects is one of the first non-movement movements, which has nothing in common except what they call discontinuous continuity. And they produce these paradoxical houses. This isn't one by them, but it's by one of their close friends. It's the exploding house with exploding space, which looks like a landmine which was left behind in the Second World War floating around. It illustrates, I don't have the best paradoxical buildings to illustrate, but it illustrates their notion of defensible, a kind of defensible space. They say, Miyawaki particularly, the man who designs blue box houses and other primary architecture houses in primary colors, he says, it's an absurd situation we're faced with in the cities. In Japan, lots are something like 100 feet wide or 50 feet wide, and may have, or even less, something like 10 or 15 feet. So that we have to build really postage stamp buildings. This is just by necessity. And then they're surrounded by pollution and noise, so that the inhabitant really is at the mercy of maybe an ugly environment or maybe one that's assaulting him all the time. So he says, let's design defensible spaces that are completely interior. So for instance, the blue box house is centered around a garden which has bamboos growing up into it. You can see it grow right up through past the living room here and into the garden. And everything looks onto that interior. Except, well, when you pull the curtains here in the living room and this little porthole here, which looks out, it's in the boy's bedroom, and it looks out on Mount Fuji. So, you know, it has a little straight view to Mount Fuji. So he's again being very traditional in what he's doing. Here's the skylight. He's masterful use of skylights. Well, Miyawaki, Mayumi Miyawaki is, I think, in many ways, the most interesting of the members of Architects. Unfortunately, I only have these 2 slides, and I have to pass over his philosophy and leave it at that. But if any of you have a chance, you can read Japan Architect and see. The architect I'll end with is one of the members called Takayama, Minoru Takayama. And here you see him outside of his office. And you see the anomalies that I've been talking about. You know, just everyday Japan with a 30-story plastic building next to a 2-story Shinto temple here, with a wedding going on and people tearing up the street and, you know, different kinds of traffic and everything at once. It's the ultimate city, Tokyo. I mean, it's really, it's the city which is alive at every moment with golf on the rooftops and, you know, anything you care to mention. City full of signs. Takayama's, one of his first big commissions was to design in an area which architects and planners hadn't touched. It was the Soho, or how do you say, where the underworld held out, hangs out. And he was commissioned to design 2 buildings in this area for bars. There are 20,000 bars in this area, and he was commissioned to design 1 bar building with 68 bars in it, and another bar building with 14. Ichiban-kan 1 and Ichiban-kan 2. And these buildings really take the traditional codes of that area, and the codes are, well, the various codes. They're these kind of things, these advertisements. They're industrial codes, color codes, and he produces, I think, really the first. I don't know what's on that other slide. He produces the first pop, I think, convincing high-class pop architecture. In other words, this is pop architecture actually done by an architect rather than by someone who isn't trying to put himself in that league. Takayama was studied with Sert and studied with Yutsen and studied with other architects' architecture. So he knows how to handle form. He mixes popular forms like bullseyes, numbers, stripes, colors, with very interesting structural forms which reveal themselves at night. So the whole thing turns, this part of it at least, turns into a beacon of advertisement at night. I think this is perhaps the example of a kind of pluralist modern architecture which is also pop. It's the best example I can think of, produced anywhere. Well, a later building he did, also a kind of a pop building, is the Beverly Tom Hotel. He started studying obscure fertility cults of, well, obscure in religion. And he produced the Tenri symbol for this hotel. A very powerful shape, which is obvious in its references. And he took the shape and he actually implanted it on every single article of the Beverly Tom Hotel, so that ashtrays have this shape on it and everything is personalized. So you can't get away from it. He said the phallic symbol is something that is universal and something which I want to put in this industrial landscape because it either recalls other forms, such as this and this, or it unifies them in rather the way, say, the Pele building does. It becomes a landmark. It becomes an urban focus. It's one of the highest buildings in that area, in really a kind of messy junkyard. Well, it's also a very articulate building made of different building systems. I mean, it's the Fuller Dome for a restaurant, which can be covered at the top. It's actually a very cheap building. It's made out of crud board, painted to look as if it's, you know, steel. Well, it's not very expensive board. I don't know what it is. Then it's what Banham calls crud board. I don't know. It's just cheap. You'll have to read Japan Architect to get the exact reference. Then he produces this building, which is even more tantalizing in many ways than his others because of its semantic displacement. I mean, all of architects are interested in semantics and the absurd. They connect very much with that, with the group of Italian architects I mentioned last week, or last time, trying to, in a positive sense, give new notions of housing, so that he builds this, these set of blocks here, black boxes, which look like they're steel, they're actually wood, and he sets them on another system of concrete, which look as if they're extract units, but in fact are circulation. They're actually large corridors, large linear corridors, which double out into spaces. The whole thing semantically looks like a prestige office block for Olivetti or some other company, doesn't it? I mean, it looks like an office or something. So it doesn't look like a house. It's actually one person's house, one family's house, with a very complex division of functional space and age zones. Takayama is going to build the same sort of thing all over here, if he has his way, next to the company factory here, family's factory, and try to do, in modern terms, a kind of very rich Kyoto-like series of semi-public spaces tapped off by these ad hoc elements. He's going to put together a richer vocabulary form than these. I mean, I think semantically the thing is all wrong. Or these could be circulation, or these could be extract units. In fact, these are just more attic space, or just space which connects up here. So they're just, it's a very funny kind of room. Personally, to intrude on a personal note, I find this, while it's interesting to displace a house towards an office building, I think it's the typical modern architect's mistake. So I don't think it's that radical in itself, and nor is it appropriate. Nor will it be, I think, extended appropriately by its inhabitants. I think it's a code which they can't use. But I think that ultimately Takayama, like the traditional Japanese architects, is very sensitive towards his tradition and towards the nuance of it. So he can admire this kind of ad hoc use of trees. The tree is a sacred thing in Shinto religion. And the heart pillar that's in the center of these shrines is never seen by anybody but the priests, so that they surround their trees. You know, they break a whole stairway up to one and let the tree live in order to create this kind of, well, what Karasawa would call antagonistic coexistence, or they allow a tree to live and build around it, build a building around it. It's this kind of thing, and part absurdity, part coexistence of opposites, which I think Takayama and all of them exhibit. So to end with, here's the final building he did for his parents in Hokkaido, in Sapporo. They had an old wooden house which they wanted to preserve on the one of the busiest street corners. So he said, right, we'll paint it and see if it can stand up. And he found out that it wouldn't even hold the paint. So he said, all right, we'll enclose it. So he called the factory and ordered corrugated aluminum, and inside the window you can just barely see this wooden structure of his parents. Very deliberate example of antagonistic coexistence, and probably a very nice way of keeping a traditional interior structure and having this extraordinary piece of diagonalism going on. Well, that's Japan. All of that was Minoru Takayama, who was in fact at Vancouver. He's coming to Vancouver if any of you want to see him. Are some of you going up there?
Most of the people are up there.
They're out there. Well, if any of you go, do tell him to come down here. I should write him in. He's going for the habitat. He's produced very many interesting things. I mean, not just the ones I've shown you. There's a lot of things to show. Any questions? Eric? Feel disappointed.
I'll ask you a question. I was thinking a little bit, looking at this, looking at what's going on in Tokyo, which is kind of a chaos. However much enjoyment you get out of it as somebody who comes and hangs around for a couple of weeks and then goes back. You know, with all the problems that it has, the kids in school have to wear masks and and all of that. You know? Trying to understand, if you forgive me again for mentioning this, what the hell it signifies. And it, you know, there's certainly times, if you look at Rome, let's say, when Hadrian was around, and you look at the public architecture, which is a consistent kind of a thing, and then you look at the house that, as I understand it, he built for himself, which does as many funny things and inconsistent things as all of these guys do. And to try to extrapolate or to relate that kind of act, you know, doing all these different kinds of things to the thing in Tokyo. And I think they're related in this sense that at that time, I think to understand it, you can't look at architectural references. It has to do with something which is way beyond architecture. And I think at that time, the Roman pantheon started to come apart, and Christianity hadn't come in yet. So there were Mithras around, and all kinds of interesting possibilities. All these perpetual possibilities. No one quite knew which one would be in ascendance, and the others would drop off. If you know what I mean? It was in one of these in-between times where you don't know, which I think is the time that we live in, and the best example of that is this. I think, you know, it starts out, I mean, if you're looking at what Sakakura and Mayakawa, and even other guys who came along later, like Maki, I didn't know what the hell he's doing now. I'm told he doesn't do anything anymore. But
oh, no, he does.
Well, but you know, people who were either with Le Corbusier or studied in this country, there was still this continuity of a kind of a modern spirit, which finally now is a totally fragmented kind of a thing. But what I'm saying is, I'd like you to comment on it, but I don't know that it's really a question, is that's really the statement we were looking for last time. You know, in other words, that's where it is, with all of these kinds of possibilities. And no one quite knows where finally it'll go. And it may take a couple hundred years. I mean, it took, anyway, 500 for Christ to go from underground to up on the ceiling. And, you know, and we're looking around for that now. And I mean, that's what that means to me, aside from the interesting possibilities of each of these ideas.
But in a way, I think you're looking for, you know, you're looking for Christ, whereas I'm looking for more pagan gods. Maybe that's the difference. And, you know, I mean, Hadrian's Villa, I think, is a very good example of eclecticism and exactly the historical crisis that you describe, you know, where he consciously revives different styles and does an Egyptian building. So I think it's a very, very good parallel with Japan and with the situation at present.
But then he could go and do, at least he gets credit for doing something like the Pantheon, which in scale and in attitude is a kind of a conventional monument to
his cosmology.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but he's...
So he's schizoid about that, and yeah, it depends which one you want to believe, but I would tend to believe the house.
Well, then next time you're anticipating what I'm going to say and bringing up the word schizophrenia. I'm going to put forward radical schizophrenia as a positive position to take. And, you know, I think that Hadrian would be the ideal architect. And in a way, in a way the Japanese can do it. You know, they can do a straight traditional building, which implies a consensus when they feel it. And the consensus works very strangely in Japan. Much more differently than it does in American politics or in Western politics. It filters indirectly. You never criticize someone directly in Japan, but you get consensuses. And they have that kind of architecture, you know. But at the same time, it's a true pluralism. They can have these traditional rooms in a modern building, or they can just have many different kinds of rooms. And they seem to be able to do that in a way that say someone like Venturi can't seem to do it, who's trying to, but just doesn't have his connection to his past. They have.
But it's a very personal thing. I mean, some can do, I mean, for example, Isozaki, who is a fantastic architect, can do that. But there are others that seem, I mean, now Kurokawa starts to be a little confused after a while. And Tange is too old.
You think Kurokawa's confused? I think he can do it all. I don't think maybe he does it with the intensity that Isozaki does, but he does it. You see, even Maekawa does. They all do it.
But Maekawa is a very consistent guy. And you couldn't call Kurokawa consistent except in its inconsistencies.
No, but Maekawa can accept traditional tatami rooms in his Harumi apartments, for instance. And they can accept donning traditional clothes and partaking in traditional tea ceremonies. They can change clothes 4 times a day and not. And so if you try to actually use the word schizophrenia, it doesn't work because they don't experience the tensions. That's the funny thing that we experience. We experience the anomalies or so forth. They don't. So it probably, I mean, this is an aside, but.
How do you know they don't experience the tension?
Well, they do actually, but in a different. They have different tensions, but they don't experience. What is the word? It's not anomaly. It's the irony, or well, it's some. Anyway, it escapes me at the moment.
Well, it's a split personality. You can't.
It's like all that, but it's something like incongruity. Yeah. Any more? Incongruity, I suppose, is the closest word. I mean, whereas if you go there, you start laughing and say, God, that's incredible. What's incredible, they say to you. They don't see it as incredible. It's everyday life is just this mélange. To me, that's very much like a city. I mean, it is that way. You know, to me, Tokyo is what Jane Jacobs is talking about in the lively city. Of course, they say it's noisy and smelly, and they don't like the chaos too much. But they support it, basically. When it comes down to it, they support it rather than try. Yeah.
It really is an impossible place to live. You know, you're doing this from long range, the sort of Kevin Lynch or Gene Jacobs analysis of some street in Ginza or something. But the reality is you just can't live there. I mean, there are tremendous problems just in going to and fro. There's no housing, there's no air. That's why they have all these funny. Have you seen that Tokaido 2000 thing that Urtek did, Tange's office? Which is a real, you're talking about Herman Kahn, which is absolutely a good reference, because what they did is they said, well, we got this many cars now, and in the year 2000, therefore, geometrically or arithmetically or whatever it is, we'll have that many. And they got these huge, it's beautifully presented, but it's just abject nonsense. I mean, it takes off from the Tokyo Bay thing, and it's just got these huge trunk lines and all of that. You know, which is quite seductive as models and drawings, but just senseless.
Yeah, but I think they've, you know, they've had a different experience because of their economic miracle than, say, anywhere in the West. I mean, they've grown at 10 to 15% a year, right? And so they haven't experienced so much. And they had a housing problem, a fantastic housing problem given to them by the Second World War, all right? Just whole cities destroyed. Nagoya completely bombed every day by the Americans, saturation bombing. In fact, Kurokawa grew up there and describes how he was out in the fields setting building phony cities so they would bomb the wrong one. He was only a small boy, but I don't think that you can lay the failings of modern architecture so much at the architect's feet. Maybe a bit Tange, but as I said, Tange is very much out of favor, and the bigness. You know, Kurokawa is not in favor of bigness, and I would say, and yet he's considered too big an architect by the other architects. So they're all into the small is beautiful, or not all of them, but a lot of them are, and are aware of the way that their fast growth hasn't produced a better way of life.
At the same time, they do those 68 bar buildings and all that.
Yeah, but to understand that is, again, I don't think you can apply Western philosophies to it, because just the way the Love Hotel comes from their apartment life. The bar things, they don't have any living room, you see. And if you have to entertain a friend, you don't take them home, you take them to this bar. And the bar is a room as big as this room. And it's a collective living room when 20 families or 30 families subscribe to it. and bring their friends there, and they have their own bottles.
It's not a public bar.
It's a semi-public bar. They can bring in outsiders, but
You or I just couldn't walk in and get it.
some you can. Some are completely public bars in that large bar thing, but more they're living rooms, you see, outside of the house. So again, it doesn't quite work to criticize them as if they're bars, right?
So small, it's beautiful, then it's still big. That way.
Well, they're very small bars. Each one is small. And they don't go from one to another. They don't go pub crawling the way the English do. Thank you.
Then I guess all we have to do is expand to a high-tech megastructure and still be a function producer.
Yeah.
That's what Glenn and I think of.
No. Architectures around the world, which I've covered in previous lectures, Japan and America being countries I'll concentrate mostly on tonight. It's really an attack on the failure of modern architecture to communicate, to be a language. Failure which I think contradicts the major intentions of the modern movement to communicate in a mass culture, in a mass society. And you can say, in a sense, that the whole drift of the last 200 years has been, in part, a drift, or an intentional shift, if you like, towards designing a language which would be in touch with the conditions of industrial society and the people in industrial society. So that in talking about architecture as a language, I'll be talking about it in a way which is a metaphor common to the modern movement. You can see that a lot of architects in the 20s and 30s justified what they were doing as a kind of vernacular language that everybody could speak, rather like everyday language, without self-consciousness, without, say, uttering malapropisms that might come from speaking in long Latin phrases or rococo curlicues, or anything that was considered, quote, unnatural, unquote. So that you get, for instance, J.M. Richards writing a book called Modern Architecture, which justifies it basically as a language. Well, I'm going to be looking at it as a language which failed to communicate. Can you turn off the lights, please? Someone? It seems to me that with this scheme of Minoru Yamasaki, famous Japanese-American modern architect, the infamous Pruitt-Igoe scheme, blown up in 1972, you have a nice symbolic date for the ending of modern architecture as a historically live movement. You probably all know it well from Oscar Newman's book, Defensible Space, and probably know some of its obvious faults. For instance, in that book, Newman says it didn't work because the corridors were too long, because there wasn't a semi-private space, because it was too much open space that was not surveyed or owned. And so he looks at it not as a language particularly, but as a kind of sociology in action. But I'm going to be treating things not so much from a social or political point of view, but from just how architecture works as a formal system. And I'm going to be criticizing it in terms of the inappropriateness of its codes. So code, the word code and the concept code is the first concept I'll be throwing at you. And it seems to me that one of its failings of this architecture is that it was designed in Le Corbusier's purist international style, or purism of Le Corbusier. And that code wasn't one that signified the right sort of thing to the inhabitants, in this case mostly blacks who were moved in here after it was built in 1955. It won an AIA award, a grand award, after it was designed, because it illustrated so many of the ideas of modern architecture as then understood. The principles of CIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture. It illustrated the separation of vehicular traffic from pedestrians. It illustrated a city in a park, in a green park. It illustrated the Corbusian virtues of sun, space, and greenery, those three, what Corbusier called the three essential joys of urban living. I mean, imagine that the three essential joys should be sun, space, and greenery. What else did it illustrate? Well, illustrated play spaces for little toddlers, swings and so on, right about there somewhere. It illustrated the superblock idea, the idea of locating a large area, of relocating, sorry, a group of people in a large, isolated, defined estate, a housing estate, called a superblock. Illustrated the slab block idea of living in 16, 11-story slabs in this case, with streets in the air. So you see it illustrated about 10 or 12 of the major cliches of the modern movement, or don't call them cliches, call them principles. And it was systematically vandalized after it was put up, in spite of the fact that, of course, that it won this award as being the best example of modern architecture. So, in a way, it is a very key building, or set of buildings, to illustrate as showing the demise of the modern movement. Perhaps a too easy example. But you probably know the story that the crime rate went up, windows continued to be broken after they were repaired, that the mayor of St. Louis and the politicians got involved in it, became a political hot potato, and so they sunk in, I don't know, something like $6 million in it again, in making the elevators work and cleaning up the interior streets, and fixing the windows and that sort of thing. And still, the place was vandalized. So, after effort and effort to get it to work well, and nothing could be done, they decided to dynamite it. And you have those beautiful shots of say, this block here, which used to be there, going up in slow motion, rather like in Antonioni films, Zabriskie Point, you know, architecture exploding. Illustrating, I think, in a very vivid way, the fact that this building and these kinds of buildings were designed in a code that wasn't the code of the people who lived in them, and wasn't manipulated, understood, and lived in correctly as a result of the breakdown in that code, or the discontinuity between the architect's elitist code and the popular code, say, of the blacks who moved in. Well, it strikes me that, yeah.
First of all, they didn't blow up the whole project.
No.
They just blew up part of it.
Right.
So part of it is still going. But the thing, this is pointed to as an example of the kind of failure that you're talking about. And I don't know why it is, if you acknowledge the fact that there was plenty of broken windows and plenty of violence all over St. Louis in other buildings, which weren't slab blocks and weren't in heritage in some ways related to the Corbusier. So the failure, I don't see why the failure is an architectural failure, unless there are those people who claim that architecture can solve these kinds of tremendous social problems.
No, I mean, I wouldn't claim...
If nobody makes that claim...
Well, first of all, Oscar Newman does make the claim, and he is a kind of architectural determinist. I mean, he admitted after he wrote the book, when he came to London, that he really does believe in a kind of indirect but important determinant of behavior in the architecture. And so in his book, you know, he shows two different schemes where the same sort of people have moved into it, and they just have different architecture. So he's got a laboratory, as it were, a test case and a control, and in one where the architecture doesn't have defensible space, the crime rate is remarkably higher than the one across the street, where it has, you know, all of those social locks and small corridors. Now, I mean, I don't fully subscribe to that architectural determinism myself, but I think, other things being equal, that the architecture will make a slight difference, and maybe a relatively unimportant difference, but a slight one. And it's not so much the vandalist argument I want to even get into, because that's not what's at stake. as far as I'm concerned. What's at stake is an architecture which understands and articulates and, in a sense, extends or interprets the people's lives who are living within. And it seems to me that Pruitt-Igoe says things about living which equate it with anonymity, which equate it with factory work, office work, and all the sorts of things which have nothing to do basically with domestic meanings. So that...
Do you have any idea what maybe an appropriate code for that particular project might have been, or would have been?
For that particular project?
Yeah, given that density, maybe that would...
Well, I think something that was on a lower, there's no absolute necessity for having slab blocks of 11 stories. Even with that density, you could build in smaller areas and have less open space, for one thing, and have more, well, I mean, I agree with more semi-private spaces. And the articulations of not only facades but interiors, streets and communal areas like laundry areas and so forth, could have been done in say the code that the people in the blacks of St. Louis very much show in their wooden housing, wood slatted housing painted fantastic colors. I mean, that could have been a point of departure, right?
But listen to those, to people like Jesse Jackson or whoever, who are in some ways, I don't know if you know that name, I assume you do. But
no, I don't.
Yeah, he's not quite a Martin Luther King, but one of these people who's now come along who's a little softer, but is supposed to be a spokesman or claims to be, and I think there's some validity for what happens in a black community. If you listen to those people talk about housing, the kinds of things that I don't know what you're referring to, which is more viable than that. But the fact of the matter is that in terms of violence, in terms of absolute social chaos, conditions seem to be pretty much impossible in Hunters Point and Roxbury and Bedford-Stuyvesant and Watts and all of that, in a variety of densities. A variety of housing styles. So it just seems to me that there are other things which are the root causes of this.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, entirely. I mean, I think, as I've said in answer to you before, its architecture can only make a marginal difference. All right? But insofar as it can make a difference, I think it's terribly important. I mean, since we're architects, I'm talking now as an architect, not as a citizen. But if, obviously, if you want to change society, you attack it on a political or social level. You don't try to change it with architecture. You're mad, right? I mean, that's just a waste of your time and everyone else's expectancies. You just can't do it. But insofar as you're an architect who's conscious of these problems, you still can articulate them differently and make that marginal difference. So that's what I'm going to talk about.
I think the failure is the claim, for example, of something like the Athens Charter, which in fact claims to be able to do all of these things for people.
Sure.
If society will only build in a certain way.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, it's really sad but true that for the last 170 years, about when utilitarianism takes on in America and England, the only way architects and city planners and landscape architects have gotten anything through is to terrorize the public into saying that our job is important because if you don't accept it, there's going to be rioting on the streets. And you go right back to, say, Chadwick's long book of 1843. It's saying something like the effects of public walks and recreation space on the mores and happiness of the working classes. And you read between the lines, it's an attempt to keep down urban revolution. The same thing as Olmsted. All of these people were, in a sense, getting through nice projects, but having to bludgeon society into accepting them, point a gun at their head, like Oscar Newman does, and say, if you don't accept me, there'll be riots on the street. Of course, then they accepted them, and there were still riots in the street. And so everybody was disenchanted and thought, well, if there's just a different style, a different kind of architecture, that'll solve the social problem. Well, you can see that, the modern movement also used those kind of false hopes. And, people get jobs today. I mean, it's a kind of, there's an ideological necessity for architects to justify their work in these kind of grand and deterministic terms. So that's a sad failing of our society. But I mean, and it's not just architects who do it. It's kind of all professions tended to overrate their importance. Or I don't know, Harvey Perloff was talking about this last night. He's saying, you know, that everybody is getting things through by speaking in these cliches, which industrial society accepts and then gets disappointed with. Anyway, maybe I'll come back to that. I mean, as we go on. I show these two slides as a symbol of just the 18th century thing. I wanted to show an 18th century ruin and a folly, you know, that the sort of the lord of the manor would erect on his country house estate on the edge of it to remind him of the grandeur that was Rome and the past. He'd build it as a folly. It was called a folly, and it occurs to me that maybe Pruitt-Igoe, like the Berlin Wall, should be preserved as a folly to modern architecture and its mistakes in theory. I think they're mistakes in theory. Well, let me, just before I get going, let me say what I won't be talking about, which is just as important as what I am talking about, and it really relates to it, but I simply can't get into it, and that is the social issue. The fact that modern architecture, from the from the turbine factory of Peter Behrens in 1909 in Berlin, built for AEG, the General Electric of Germany, the multinational today. From that to the Seagram's building, built by a student of Behrens, Mies van der Rohe, 1958 in New York. The history of modern architecture really is the history of monuments to building tasks which can either be questioned, such as monopolies to whiskey, or monopolies to Lever soap, or monopolies to Pepsi-Cola, which are the major three buildings on Park Avenue, by the way. Or actually, what's the other one? The Pan Am building. So it's the four major monuments of modern architects are designed for this kind of commission. And it goes right back through here, and right back to 1909. Or else they are things like World's Fairs, or the great exhibitions of the 19th century. Or things like boutiques. We saw a lot of that in the Italian lecture. Or candle shops. Again, Hans Holleins. I mean, if one says the greatest amount of design skill and creativity is expended on a candle shop, or World's Fair, or, well, let's see, what else? Expos. Expos is where they spend money. And restaurants. You can say, and prestige university buildings, I think that about exhausts the major money-spinning things of our society. Then you can say that and individual houses. And shopping centers. Okay. Those building tasks, no, people don't really build, you know, grand houses, really grand. I mean, in the sense that they did San Simeon. Well, no, John Lautner's things, well, anyway. I must get on with this talk. In any case, the previous building tasks which excited architects and for which architecture was built were things like country houses, palazzo, or town halls, or churches, or civic centers, cathedrals. And these building tasks had a kind of credibility up to the 18th century, or say the 19th century, up to 1800. You know, you really could, as an architect, believe that the town hall was a significant institution, and the politics which went on inside it was credible, and therefore design a facade. And of course, one of the meanings of architecture is edification, to build edifices to educate the public. They could expend money and design, create creatively, with a kind of clear conscience and exuberance and utopian feeling, because the building tasks weren't quite obviously commercial, or maybe even bizarre, as they are today. You can see in, say, the futurist case where they really embrace that. They say, well, we no longer have the cathedral, we have the power station. And you know, the dynamo instead of the Virgin, that famous antithesis of Henry Adams. And so the futurists, you know, design their great power stations. And Santilia talks about the fantastic new commissions that are coming along, like large hotels and office buildings. And he even mentions urban crowds and mass behavior and neon lights. So he's describing Las Vegas and so forth. He even describes beautiful demolitions. You can see that there's an attempt then in the 20s, following the futurists, and particularly with people like Corbusier and the constructivists, to make modern, everyday mass life into something heroic. But after the 20s, that heroism dies because quite evidently, mass culture and consumer society is not interested in even the palace of Soviets or whatever was the utopian political and social feeling of the 20s, and it becomes then these kind of things, particularly that thing on the left. And part of the problem of the language of modern architecture is this problem, because if you are designing these sort of commissions, then, and that's where society is spending its extra money for architecture, then you are immediately put into a kind of doubt as to what to express and how to articulate it. In other words, I think these commissions themselves exert a kind of impoverishment of the language or repression of certain aspects of architectural language. But I'm not going to talk about that, okay? That's what I'm not talking about. Now, looking at the formal systems, the one of Mies van der Rohe is the one I'm going to use as typical of all modern architecture, even though, in a sense, it's rarefied. It's what I characterize as a univalent formal system. Univalent meaning a single meaning or a simple meaning or a set of reduced meanings. And as univalent formal system, evolving from the concrete frame here in the promontory apartments of 1948 in Chicago to this one here in 1951, the Lakeshore Drive apartments, the famous one, which is always illustrated in books on modern architecture, shows his univalent system very well. It's a cage system based on steel I-beam mullions, encased steel columns, spandrels, and glass here. It's a system which he said, in another context, is universal. That is to say, he said it could be applied without worrying to any function whatever. He said functions change, functions are ephemeral, building tasks are unimportant, societies, we may have 2 or 3 different civilizations in my building. It's a universal formal system so that it'll absorb whatever we put into it. Well, it seems to me this shows a peculiarly 20th century kind of contempt for function, for society and building tasks. Because what is Mies saying, essentially, by putting people behind this curtain wall of glass and steel? He's saying that the difference between office work and living is unimportant, that one function is like the other. In a sense, then, he's equating them. By not differentiating between the two, he's saying that working and living are the same thing, or that the difference is trivial. Secondly, and more importantly, because that's on a literal level, he's saying that the whole psychic thing of what a home is and what living in a house is not something that he's going to articulate in any particular way. So he explains nothing about what it is to live in Chicago, except that he allows the inhabitants to pull down the shade 1/3, 1/2, or full. That's the kind of one piece of personalization he's allowed on the exterior, at least, these inhabitants. Well, you know what happens to this formal system. It's, oddly enough, first designed for domestic accommodation by Mies in 1951, and then it becomes the sign of office building around the world. It's picked up by a follower of his, Murphy, and most of you, I'm sure, know this building, but those of you who don't, just try to recognize it on a literal level. See what building task it is, what its function is. See if you can guess to yourself. And see then, on a more important level, on, say, psychological level, what kind of meanings and metaphors is it conveying to you? Well, it conveys to you the top is different from the rest, and there's a section in here which is different, and probably the mechanical equipment. So it's the parts convey mechanical equipment here on the top and here on the 8th floor. So it conveys that they're long spans of bronzed, corten steeled I-beams and bronzed glass, and it conveys something about the black box concept. So a primitive feeling of power. And primitive is the operative word in all of this. It's a very fundamentalist image, a highly univalent, simplified image which records well on TV and records well in architectural magazines when photographed down. It's one that can immediately be understood without any kind of ambiguity. And in fact, it's one which articulates, in this case, the Civic Center of Chicago. So the place where, you know, the city hall, the place where people come and go to get divorces, people come and go to pay traffic fines, people go to court, people meet their politicians. People, you know, do this sort of thing, and this is an idyllic version of participatory democracy. It's in Switzerland, but I'll make it stand for what American democracy once was before the cities sold out. Basically, it's in its conception, it's that, but in its reality, it's that. So it strikes me that this, that Murphy, you know, didn't even understand the question of how does one convey the very important civic function of a meeting place, a town hall, collective government. He was just clearly designing, you know, his supposedly universal formal system, and that was the end of the matter, with a vague overtone of power. So you can say that he understood, you know, the essence of Mayor Daley's Chicago on that level, and that's no doubt why it was commissioned and appealed. And let's look at one part of the Misesian system used coherently throughout a campus, the IIT campus, designed from 45 to basically 55 in that 10-year period by Mies. He uses his universal system of black I-beams and glass and this beige brick. And you go around the campus on this carpet of green, looking at the different buildings, and on the most banal, literal level, you say, well, what are they? Well, that's probably a classroom, that's probably a classroom, that's probably a classroom. And what is he conveying about them? Well, probably the classrooms are saying that the students are working in a factory, churning out one creative idea after another on an assembly line, because, you know, the metaphor is your school is a factory to live in or work in. The only indication of what the actual building is comes from something that Mies clearly didn't design, which is this inverted dish on the roof, representing the fact that it may be a classroom for astrophysics or astronomical research or something. But what architects talk about is this corner of the building. There have been vast scholastic disputations at the AA where I teach in London between Sir Leslie Martin and Lord Llewellyn Davis, Lord Llewellyn Davis, the head of the Bartlett School of Architecture, and Sir Leslie Martin, head of the Cambridge School of Architecture, meet at the Architectural Association and talk for 3 hours on the essence of this corner and whether it conveys openness and endlessness or closedness. I think it's Sir Leslie who says it's closed. It's clearly a closed corner because, you know, it's a black visual stop to a building rather like a pilaster and a Renaissance building. Whereas Lord Llewellyn counters and says, no, no, don't you understand that the extension of these corners beyond the end stops is implied by the reentrant angles here and the I-beam here, which signifies that conceptually or virtually speaking, this building extends to infinity. Therefore, it's one of the first buildings in the endlessness aesthetic. And so the debate roars and rages in London, and students listen and become very interested in this kind of signification. Well, you can see that kind of elitism, and if you go around the campus and look for yourself up close to find out what's happening, you see that indeed it's a kind of fetish. Crowds of people come around every day to see themselves and see what's happening there. You know, these are people off the street wondering, is it so important? But you go around the rest of the campus and you ask yourself literally and psychically, what are these buildings telling you about themselves? What is that, for instance? Does it say anything? Might be student union, might be the restaurant, might be shopping center. You know pretty well that's a cathedral because it's a basilical plan with an aisle here and a nave in the center and another aisle to the side, and it has clerestory windows even on the aisle. I mean, it's a beautiful cathedral with clerestory there and clerestory there and a regular bay system. And it even has a campanile or bell tower at the end. So all the signs are working to tell you you recognize the first building on campus correctly. And that's good. And you come to the boiler house, which is the most nondescript building, sitting packaged between high-rise beige brick and the other things. And you know, it's just a little box set off to one side and has a searchlight in the corner. It doesn't, nothing. Boiler house. And then finally the President's Lodge, which is clearly the most important building on campus. It's in the heroic Michelangelesque order of grand columns painted in jet black here, suspending the building underneath it, and then a minor order, like Michelangelo, major and minor, of black mullions here, reached by a double flight of stairs, miraculously suspended in kind of a white marble here. Clearly, you know, this building with its axis approach, the only building in different aesthetics, so at least you know, his univalent formal system wasn't universal after all. He had to change it at least once. This is the president and administration. Well, you all realize, I guess, what those buildings in fact are. This is not the cathedral, it's the boiler house. That's not the boiler house of the church, and that's not the president's house. It's the School of Architecture, quite naturally. Had to be. Because Mies, like Bucky Fuller or Korb, and other people who believed in the universal architect as the universal panacea, basically, you know, placed great store on their capacity to change society. And symbolizes that. In fact, if you kind of read this as a message, he is saying that architects are pagan gods. You know, our classical Greek gods who are going to rule over society. I mean, that would be a kind of straightforward, dumb interpretation of this, of the signs on this building. Okay, you may think that it's too easy to criticize Miesian system, and we've moved beyond that, but it seems to me that we've just moved beyond it in name and not in fact, because for instance, the formalist reaction that occurred against the Miesian glass and steel cage of the 60s, that is to say the sculptural masonry push-pull aesthetic, was equally uncommunicative or inappropriate in the way it signified. And an example which I've shown you before bears this out. This designed by Gordon Bunshaft on the Mall, which signified to just almost everybody who wrote about it in the popular press, it signified pillbox, concrete machine gun slits. All these metaphors about a museum, and it's the only museum of modern art in Washington on a public level, signified things about the collector and the role of modern art which were completely opposed to the meanings that Bunshaft obviously wanted to convey. Unless, of course, you assume that he actually considers art something to be removed and hidden away from the public, but then why, of course, put it in the middle of the mall? Well, so clearly the popular code, in the sense the code that everybody knows if they visited, you know, Normandy, the beaches of Normandy, or if they've read any books on the Second World War, or might have just seen a few movies, that kind of code was not acknowledged by Bunshaft. Another building of his here, which just look at and try to recognize on a literal level, should be an office building, according to the Glass and Steel Convention, Core 10. A miraculous one, maybe a prestige office building for Olivetti, because it's on, you know, stylobate, and then it's on little, I suppose, some kind of columns, is in fact the School of Psychology at Cornell, elevating psychologists to the primary role. Other examples of the formalist reaction I showed were this, you know, literally speaking, it's a warehouse. It's using the warehouse code, but it's another Museum of Modern Art in Houston. And this inadvertent betrayed symbol of the Roman aqueduct in this kind of kitsch, modern Helena Rubinstein design by Frank Lloyd Wright. Something that he would, I think, you know, he inadvertently betrayed as much as the other formalists. Well, even those who are trying to get away from the boredom of modern architecture in Spain or in America, trying to enrich language and talking about architecture as a language, and Graves, Michael Graves is doing that, and so is Ricardo Bofill in Spain, are, it seems to me, still making kind of patterns. This is the more typical kind of thing that's happening around the world. It's elegant pattern making, elegant formal geometric and sensuous rhythms here, basically the curved rhythm for a balcony, and then a flat volumetric backdrop in red tile here. Those kind of meanings, which are basically aesthetic meanings, are being conveyed and are quite delightful, but only delightful because you set them against something that's much more boring. And when you go to this building, it's a 20-story building outside of Barcelona with 8 or 10-story entrances and 14-story holes cut in it, the overwhelming feelings you get as you walk through the scheme are ones up here, as you walk around these interior spaces and bridges, ones of either claustrophobia as you go in, or vertigo and nausea as you get up there. So Bofill, who is, you know, sensitive and to a certain extent sympathetic person when he talks about architecture, is still entrapped in the pattern-making sculptural game. Someone like Graves, who is trying to push architecture in a more rich formal system, is still using formal languages that are restricted to an elite. For instance, this building, the Benacerraf House of 1965, is clearly a building that can only be decoded by someone who knows the Rietveld Schroeder House, the building that's also stuck on the end of another building, and knows the work of Corbusier, the way Corb handles picture windows, openings, railings, and certain geometries of column and beam. For instance, this blue element here, which I had always thought was just a balustrade, turns out to be a column line on its side, according to Graves. Well, the only way we could perhaps know it's a column line in its side painted blue is, you know, to have a reader's guide, another book written, and a set of notes as we walk through his building. So it strikes me that, you know, it's not just Mies, it's not just the formalists, it's also the serious architects. And just to show a few more examples, the work of the Smithsons, which with the work of Team 10 has tried quite consciously to get away from anonymous, inhuman city dwelling. The Smithsons quote Aldo van Eyck, who says, we must make a place of every space and assist man's homecoming in our large cities. So that basically Van Eyck tries, and so do the Smithsons, try to design personalized space which is meaningful to the local inhabitants. The Smithsons very much trying to do that and trying to give urban identification, what they call urban identification. Well, they look to Bath, the Crescent at Bath particularly, and they say the interesting thing about Bath is as a language of architecture. They say it's a universal language of architecture which was understood by the inhabitants of Bath on a very banal level, for instance, in its detailing of corbels here, in its wrought iron fence, in its use of such things as chimneys, party walls, and columns. You know, it's a rich language, but it's at the same time it's unified. If only we could get this in the 20th century, they say, you know, reiterating the remark for the 1000th time. Almost every modern architect has said that we need a universal language which is unified, which people understand. Furthermore, they say that this architecture gave people identity because it picked out a vertical unit here in terms of the columns and the chimneys and party walls that more or less identified the owner's house. And lastly, it was an architecture of metaphor, they say, because the pediments over the doors and the large end pavilions, which were pulled away and designed with a little bit of ornament, indicated a more important room or a more important house, so that these pediments and pavilions then became metaphors of importance. Their analysis of Bath is very nice, as they take you through it. They have written a book called A Walking Guide to Bath, and it's very, it shows great insight. But then what happens when they try to redesign a 20th century version of it? This scheme, Robin Hood Gardens, finished in about 1974 in the East End of London. Well, they say we will give urban re-identification by taking these large slab blocks and kinking them slightly at the corners. That will give identity and place, see? And putting a funny little mound here in the middle. You can see a boy walking up it. And that sort of thing will make it a place rather than an anonymous space. Secondly, it will be designed in a universal language appropriate to our time, which is to say, an industrial language. They say, since we live in the machine age, the architecture must reflect the machine age metaphor, must look as if it were made by a machine, and must be anonymous. So there you can see a leap of their thought patterns, which is clearly based on a fallacy. Because the fact that the machine is in certain case important in the 20th century is no reason, therefore, to use it as an overriding metaphor. Because one of the reasons that people hate this kind of building, and particularly here, is that the machine is, you know, just the wrong kind of meaning they want in a house. Anyway, the Smithsons then go on to say, well, we've allowed personalization in this scheme by, you see, allowing the inhabitants to have different color curtains, and they can hang out their wash from time to time, and they have geraniums and so on. So that's, you know, that's extraordinary, and this is, it seems to me, brings up the whole credibility gap of modern architecture, that when you hear them talk about the values of identity and place, they sound very convincing. But when you look at what they do, you can see that there's a kind of hiatus in their thought, or there's a leap into exactly the wrong set of meanings. This kind of thing signifies to the East Enders that they live on the wrong side of the street. It signifies social deprivation. It signifies that the authorities couldn't afford to build it out of wood. All right, that's what it basically means. It's kind of such a low level but obvious set of meanings that only an architect could not be aware of them. Well, they'd criticized Corbusier's Streets in the Air, and then as being you know, vacuous, empty spaces which were windswept and not used. And then they say what they needed was to have them open and a little bit wider. So they tried that and put in a door step here. But it doesn't bring back the urban life of the city, basically the 19th century row housing that they admire in the working class districts at all. It ends up being, you know, windswept, littered, vandalized, and in certain parts of it burnt out, in fact.
Joost ever showed a project in Amsterdam, I think, by Vandenbroek, which did a similar thing, had a street in the air, and it works beautifully. You know.
The street in the air.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the project?
I've seen that sort of work by Vandenbroek and Bakema. Some of it works all right, but it seems to me it could have worked much, much better. They used more traditional and possible patterns of location.
Maybe that's the difference, is that was brick and,
No, I don't think that the brick...
wooden front door and all of that.
The brick matters, but, I think that the decision to elevate this off the street and not provide enough activities which relate to the ground is the crucial difference here, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to put it up 3 floors unless you can really bring a lot of activities up to that floor. And even if you...
What I'm really asking is exactly what you're talking about in terms of a code. I mean, is the code the street in the air, or is the code this concrete railing?
The code, the architectural code is both, because ultimately you can't separate the perception of function from the actual function. So if people perceive this as socially deprived corridor space, then even if in fact it has niches in it and crannies, it'll be used as socially deprived corridor space. In other words, people will write on it and will burn it out. So
covered with shingles,
That would make a difference. A marginal but important one. When I say marginal, I don't mean that it isn't important. It's just not going to be a great difference, but an important one, I mean, if he's...
You always conceive it as social deprivation, no matter what you do for it.
No, I don't agree. If you...
Well, I know the project we were involved with, which is exactly a completely different kind of thing than what you're showing here. On-grade, patios, wood, all the kinds of things people consider completely social deprivation. They're doing the same thing to it that you would do to any project. Beating up the wood, beating up the windows, smashing up everything, killing the plants, and it has nothing to do with the architecture.
Well, I think, to a certain...
Themselves. They don't want to be in any kind of housing of any sort, whether it be, as long as, it's given to them by the government, let's put it that way, in any sense. So it gets very difficult to, as an architect, to deal with these kinds of issues. I think when I think, as Eric was pointing out, and I think we started with that it's really a social problem, and it's one that isn't going to be solved no matter what the hell our language.
Well, no, because it's a social perception of a problem. Okay, so, it's a perception which is in a code. And so, on a mundane level, taking the work of Oscar Newman, just cosmeticizing certain of those high-rise dwellings and adding ersatz things to them, actually, putting in breakable lamps actually brought down vandalism. When they see that the lamps could be easily broken, there was no breakage, apparently, in 2 years. So, the cosmetic thing done attentively and done continuously will start to make a difference, it seems to me. What I'm really talking about, though, is more the difference between the intentions of personalization, which the Smithsons talk about, and the complete lack of trying to understand how these people might personalize their place. If personalization and identity are at stake here, even if they don't solve the problem, because if these people really want detached houses individually in suburbia and they're given continuous housing, then they may always, no matter what you do with the symbols, they may always destroy them. Still, maybe that's true, but I doubt that. But if it's true, let me still point out the gap, the credibility gap in what the Smithsons are doing, what they're saying. So you find here, a vandalist in another raincoat happily destroying a light bulb here, you see, encased in non-breakable glass. I caught him in the act. It's actually the correspondent of the New York Times, Paul Goldberger, another critic who doesn't like this building much more than I do. Well, you can go right through Team 10. You can go through the followers of Team 10, people like Hermann Hertzberger, who is the architect in the moment in England because of this building. This is the most humanist building in Europe, according to the Architectural Review and Building Design, the two organs of, architectural thought. And it illustrates, what it is an old people's home outside of the center of Amsterdam. It's an impossible commission to begin with, because the traditional way of housing the old and the senile and about to die in Holland has been traditionally to put them in 3 or 4 story housing in brick with pitched roofs in small enough numbers in the community. So, and that has been done up to the 1950s. But then, for social reasons, the government decided to locate 1,000 of them in a big area. So 2,000 people, 1,000 units, already outside of the center, you see. So they're changing the vernacular pattern of social existence, the authorities. And because it's such a difficult thing, who do they get? The most humane modern architect in Holland. Give him the problem. Let's see if he can solve it and take off some of the criticism that's going to come our way. So, of course, Hermann Hertzberger, being, a guy who needs a job and being a social idealist, accepts this impossible commission and then designs this. Well, he's tried to break it up into many small slab blocks, which are of different height. It also indicates a kind of care because he constructs it of precast T members here and precast other members between them, these kind of inverted U's, and he infills it with this kind of dark metallic and wooden infill structure. Also, the building communicates not only that care, the care of, say, a Chinese puzzle, but it communicates his and Team 10's acceptance of Kahn's architecture, the distinction between servant and served, and the emphasis on the build, right? The build, those words of architects, in capital letters that indicate their love of, Luke Kahn says, if you want to know about architecture, you have to draw these lines where the formwork stops, and that's what it's all about. It's understanding that that's the poetry of architecture. So it conveys those meanings. It does communicate that. But it seems to me that, like Bunshaft's buildings, like everyone you care to mention's buildings, it's an inadvertent betrayal of exactly the wrong meaning. Because what is the metaphor here? It's a series of black caskets stuck within white crosses. The most, it is on a popular, boring, dumb level. It's indicating that death, that old age has become rather disastrous. So these 2,000 people slink home every night to this mortuary, this humanistic mortuary. Well, that's the most sensitive modern architect. Now, let me cut that kind of flagellation of modern architects and stop that whole negative thing and start on the way I think architecture can be a language. Modern architecture can be in certain aspects of it. And I'll go into basically 4 different aspects. First is metaphor, which I think is maybe the most important at the moment because it's been the most overlooked, the metaphorical level of communication. The next one is syntax, after that words, and finally semantics. I'll briefly cover these areas. 4 different ways in which architecture can be considered a language. Well, metaphor. It seems that an aspect of all thought is to map the unknown onto the known, so that if you're faced with an unfamiliar building or something that's new, almost an unconscious and intuitive process that starts immediately is to map it A to B, or, just like a map that you use when you navigate. So when you see that form, for instance, if you saw it 10 years ago in England, you'd say that looks like a cheese grater, or that looks like a beehive, or a chain link fence, or a V for victory sign if it's just been after Dunkirk or something. And then you come across this one, which you've seen before, and clearly that looks like stacked washing machines. Okay, because the closest thing in our code to this white painted box with a round opener, which you open to put in the laundry, is indeed some kind of a washing machine. Well, these kind of reactions, which are picked up in the popular press and which are common to most people, I'd say everybody, when faced with an unfamiliar form, are the kind of levels of meaning that have been disregarded. When I asked Karasawa about the washing machines, he said, oh no, those are bird cages. Don't you know that in Japan, we make little concrete bird cages with round openings that the birds fly into. And so here's my bird cage for the 140 bachelors who fly in here with their birds and take them home.
Does that mean you misunderstood the builder?
No, that's exactly. I mean, exactly. Both are right. There was having the typical conflict of codes there. I mean, if he's right, which I'm not sure, but it was very clever of him. If in the Japanese code, you know, the concrete birdcage of the hole is that strong, then perhaps it's, and the washing machine code isn't, then perhaps these metaphors, these mechanical ones, aren't so disturbing in this thing. On the other hand, it is shoebox and filing cabinet, two metaphors which have appeared like cliches about modern housing. So, and one, in fact, I do know that poor Kurokawa has suffered as the capsule architect, and people haven't liked his capsules for living. They commissioned him to do other buildings. Well, in any case, what happens is that metaphors in architecture, like metaphors in language, if used long enough, become cliches. And so you no longer say, after 10 years of use of this type of building form on a building, you don't say it looks like a cheese grater, you say it looks like a parking garage. And so that words become stabilized around through use, through feedback, which is, of course, a major theory of communication, of semiotics, that the usage of the words you speak is set by feedback. Well, now, it seems to me that traditional architects, either on a vernacular level, as in this building area in southern France, it's a Bastide, that traditional architects would understand the metaphorical aspect of doorway, of entrance from the public street into the even more public square here, and articulate it through, in this case, syntactical changes, you know, just a difference between two arch forms that meet at an odd juncture. Or, say, in a high art level, they would articulate this, the very important transitional area, the doorway, with conventional signs, either caryatids or heroic, muscular Hercules. So they were responsible for taking the erogenous zones of a building, that is doorways and windows and roofs and things like that, and working with metaphors and conventional signs to making them important areas of experience. Very few modern architects have done that. One is, of course, Utzon at the Sydney Opera House, which was designed around a series of metaphors. It was seen as seashells, as waves. If you go around Sydney and you see the blue sea, and then these little the foam, you can see how appropriate that metaphor is, or sympathetic. Seen as flowers unfolding, so petals, you know, opening up. Seen in organic terms as shells, flowers, petals. It was seen even, well, the most obvious metaphor was the journalistic cliche, it's a series of sailboats and sails in Sydney Harbor. And that was the one it was sold on, that metaphor. So you can see that the Sydneyites were willing to spend not the original $7 million, but as it turned out, something like 140 to 170 million, 1,000 times the original cost, just for sails, right? The sail metaphor. Or perhaps a few others. The ones that I like the best are fish swallowing each other, and a traffic accident with no survivors, and a scrum of nuns, which may be not one that makes too much sense, but is an actual favorite of people in Sydney. They do talk about, you know, with the nuns down on their backs, with their heads down, charging into each other, with their cowls going up. Anyway, whole series of metaphors. Now, modern architects and a lot of critics really hated the building because it wasn't in the code that they'd associated with auditorium. Typical word of modern architecture from the 20s on, and you saw it in constructivism, was the wedged pie-shape form, which signified theater, because the sight and acoustic lines naturally generated it as a kind of iconic architecture where the signifier and the signified were the same, or at least related. Whereas in this, the signifier and the signified are disjunctive, and you can't read off the fact that there's two auditorium here and a restaurant here, right? And the fly tower here. Well, you might, if you knew there were auditorium there and there, you would infer that there was one. So that shows in the attacks on this building by critics and modern architects, you can see there another example of this attack of one code on another code. And in a sense, I think you can talk about the breakdown of modern architecture as a conflict of codes rather than people. In other words, it's the way they habitually decode and see things that's important. Personally, I think it's an important building because these metaphors are appropriate. These organic metaphors of unfolding are appropriate to cultural activity. If one renamed it the Sydney Cultural Centre rather than the Sydney Opera House, and saw it for what it is really, it's a cultural statement and a meeting place for all sorts of different kinds of things, then it strikes me that that it's worth it, these metaphors. And when the Queen visited Australia, the students of architecture drew this cover for the architectural magazine of turtles making love to each other and dedicated it to the Queen. You can see that there is a kind of reptilian aspect of these shells seen shimmering here. Well, just maybe to bang in the point that, depending on the way you look at this form, if you read it, if you've seen more ducks than rabbits, you read it from left to right. Or if you're from Australia where there are more rabbits than ducks, you read it from right to left. Or if you've seen it too many times, you just see it as a duck-rabbit. Or if you turn your head to one side, you see it as bellows or keyholes. Or you can break the linguistic and conventional codes, but it's rather hard. And these codes, which are really intuitive and on a subconscious level and built up the day you're born, are a very important aspect of the way you see it. Now, what strikes me as perverse is the way someone like Venturi, who is, again, really committed to architecture's communication, comes along and says, no more ducks. X, the duck in Long Island, which should really sell ducks, but I don't think it does. But if it were in Los Angeles, it would. He says, duck burgers, Peking duck. He says, the problem with modern architecture is too much of a duck. I think the problem with modern architecture isn't enough like a duck and other things. But in any case, he says, we must get rid of the ducks, the decorated structure where the decoration comes from the structure, and we must design instead decorated sheds. So like a typical modern architect, he takes a whole area of communication, which is to say the iconic sign, when the signifier and the signified are connected, and he just puts a cross through it, and he says, let's disconnect the signifier from the signified here. So we have a completely dissociated schizophrenic environment. Well, he didn't say it that way. But he says this is happening for commercial reasons, and if you really want to get out there with commerce, this is what you've got to do. Anyway, you can see the forces on him that make him do this. They're the forces that are typical to modern art and architecture. The easiest proposition to understand is the one that rejects the previous position and sets off in exactly the antithetical position. So clearly, Venturi gets associated with this, and therefore that's his meaning. Well, the perversity in my terms, is why restrict oneself to less than the full gamut of communicational means. Now, ducks have problems, but at least they're minimally funny from time to time. They're sensuous. Children like them, and we're all little children. And, at 60 miles an hour, they communicate kind of just basic literal things which Mies buildings don't communicate. So that at least they're better than modern architecture, however boring they may be. And one of the problems, of course, with this is that it's a univalent metaphor in the sense that you can't see the donut as a hot dog, and you can't see the hot dog as a hamburger. So that, the problem with a metaphor that's literal like this is that it focuses your mind in and traps it on that thing, and it doesn't push you on.
So in that sense, it has the same problem as speaking.
Yeah, in that sense, it's a univalent metaphor, but at least it's a metaphor that is communicating, a certain literal truth about what the building is used for.
Well, I mean, you could say, for example, the Chicago Civic Center is a pretty good metaphor for the realities of government in Chicago, and it's just as good a metaphor as this is, regardless of Murphy's intentions.
Like people are just selling you things to eat, whereas what are politicians selling you? So I think it's, if you want to consider that an intent, of course, as a betrayed symbol of the horror of certain aspects of Chicago politics, maybe that is appropriate. But then who gets the credit? Mayor Daley, right? For making it horrible. Anyway, side issue, in a sense. What I wanted to say about this was that being a univalent metaphor is a problem. And it's one that was has been pointed out in almost all aesthetic systems. The Chinese, for instance, mentioned the importance of not focusing too strongly on certain obvious meanings, which curtail the imaginative experience of something. And you find in Western aesthetics as well that there's always an emphasis on suggesting and not always naming something explicitly. The greatest crime of a 19th century poet was to name and not suggest something. So it's, the power of the veiled metaphor, and even more, the mixed metaphor is what I'm driving towards or trying to put forward instead of just, although I would still say univalent metaphors by all means. But one really wants mixed metaphor. The area that shows that is, of course, say, Shakespearean drama. Every time Shakespeare wanted to heighten the drama, he would really overload the reference to his sign vehicles so that the mind would be sent off in a wild goose chase and rip around the local passage or the theater with great excitement. And this, really did heighten the drama. Having a whole lot of suggested reference to a metaphor is the exciting thing. Well, more iconic hot dogs. Now, the mixed metaphor, it strikes me the reason one of the reasons Rorschach has been interpreted so many different ways and appears even now on French postage stamps and is loved by a lot of Frenchmen, is that it shows it's multiply coded in so many ways, so tightly that unconsciously you race around it, even to the literal extent of being able to match funnels and light towers and prows and so forth and portholes. Trying to, You seem to have jammed. I'll have to fix that one, if you can. Can someone jump up and... I think my slide has been metaphorically swallowed. When it gets caught in there, they often end up, meat and potatoes. While we're waiting, are there any questions so far?
Yeah, I got one on talking about the metaphors and the aspect of the architect being socially conscious of his work. I wonder if you could touch on the notion of the architect as doing personal statements as somewhat an artist or a sculptor, not really having that responsibility as primary priority.
I think that it's a very dual problem, that, because clearly the architect, like the artist, is allowed a certain latitude of which the ordinary person doesn't have, which the citizen doesn't have, to express, because that's what society expects of him and demands, in fact. So he's allowed to do slightly outrageous things. Could I come back to that? That's fine. So you find metaphors, mixed metaphors in this building, which really do map extraordinarily well. Here's our old favorite, the duck, who seems to appear regularly in modern architecture as hero or villain, coming back, and his exactly, quack quack. Here's his wings mapping onto the curved, darkened part of Ronchon. Well, you go on. I've gotten out of step here. Praying hands, of course, is an important and appropriate metaphor for a church, and one which many critics have seen in the building. So the prow of the ship and the praying hands and the nun's cowl are the three most prevalent cliches seen in it. In fact, the only metaphor Corb would allow is that these large, darkened concrete elements were designed like a shell. So he allowed the shell metaphor. But clearly it's been over-coded and coded with many redundant metaphors, so that monks will take you around it and point out how, the hoods, the giant hood which looks north, is the mother sheltering her two children who look to the morning and evening sun, the east and west sun, sort of shedding a tear here or there, and very much grinning, rather like Edward Heath in that particular view. So, these metaphors, which really are pointed out by the monks and aren't just mentioned by the critics, show that the rare example of a modern architect being able to design in many codes at once, and how exciting an experience that can be. Well, example from close to home here. This curious mixed metaphor, the blue whale by Cesar Pelle, which has been seen as, I had a class analyze it at UCLA, and they came up with 17 or 18 different metaphors, including prisons and monsters on the left. Clearly, the blue whale thing comes from, the local code of this thing on La Cienega, which is the fish shanty restaurant. Because if you look at the attempts to map it as a monster or a whale, they're very tenuous, It's hard to get the visual codes working. So, in a certain sense, this shows the classic thing of modern architecture as a language. It's a stretchable language which depends very much on the context and codes of the people, more maybe than on the context and codes of what you build in, as opposed to language, which